Welcome to The Ask. I'm your host, White Zazimi, and in this episode, I'll be taking a look at the book Not Our Day to Die by author Michael Sullivan. In the 1970s, Michael found work flying small transport planes for the Maryknoll father, Bill Woods. At the time, the Maryknoll priesthood in Guatemala was working to establish a farming cooperative for poor and landless indigenous Guatemalans seeking to escape poverty. This cooperative was located in the north of the country, in a largely abandoned jungle territory called the Ishkan. Working with Father Bill, Michael played a vital role helping transport people and goods among the jungle villages the cooperative had established. It was a time of peace and hope, before violence and destruction from a terrible civil war forced the people he had known to flee for their lives. Flying in the 80s in East Africa for a medical program, and later in New Guinea, he was unaware of the massacres taking place in the Ishkan. When he learned of the terrible struggle for survival there, he returned to help, traveling to Guatemalan refugee camps in Mexico and later making a trip on foot to the area he had known to gather the stories that make up this book. Please join me on this podcast as we explore Not Our Day to Die with author Michael Sullivan. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
You actually went over to Guatemala in 1972. Looking for flying work. Can I ask, why did you choose to look for work in Latin America or Guatemala at that time in your life?
Well, about a year before I got my flying license, I worked building a house at a monastery near Abiquiu, New Mexico. And there were three guys there, Ben Jaramillo, Joe Manzanares, and Andy Gallegos, who were kind of the brains behind building the house. Andy actually had lived in the area before it became a monastery. And where I grew up, there were Hispanic people, but there was not a huge Hispanic culture. And this was my first introduction to an intact Spanish culture. And so I just decided I wanted to go down to Latin America based on the people I had met here in New Mexico.
Got you. How did you end up in Guatemala? Obviously, Latin America is, a huge continent. I'm just curious how you found yourself in Guatemala at the time.
It was pretty much just chance. I bought a motorcycle and headed south. Rode through Mexico, really just being a tourist, and I didn't look for work because I knew you had to be a Mexican citizen to fly in Mexico. In Mexico City, I met a couple kids who were lost, American kids, and I helped them find a bus station. They said they were going to Guatemala to work at a mission, and if I ever got there, I could spend the night. So I eventually got there. They had made it. They weren't in town that day, but I was leaving in the morning, and the local padre asked me, who I was, what I was doing, and he said there was this priest in Guatemala City, Bill Woods, and that he wouldn't need a pilot because he was one, but he might know somebody. So I went to see Bill Woods, and we talked, and I eventually ended up flying for him or for his co-op for about 2.5 years.
So that's interesting. So it was actually entirely by chance that you connected with Father Bill Woods, or Padre Guillermo, as he's referred to in your book by many of your interviewees.
Yeah, that's correct. It just happened. It was actually the first place I had just started looking for work, and he was the first person I talked to.
Was there sort of a religious angle to you in terms of going down to Latin America at the time, or was it just you were just traveling through the area at the time and this opportunity came up for yourself?
Yeah, it was just pure chance. I was just looking for wanted to be a bush pilot, and I was just looking for a flying job, and I met Bill. It wasn't really a religious persuasion or anything. It just happened. We connected in the city, and things take forever in Guatemala, so this was really fascinating. We connected at the Maryknoll father's house in Guatemala City. We rode our motorcycles to the zoo, which was by the airport. And at the zoo, an old man with a box camera took a photograph of me he didn't have any negatives, so he took the photograph on paper, photographic paper, and then which came out in a negative image. And then he put the paper on a little stand in front of his camera and took a picture of that, and I had a positive. We took that to the Aeronautica Civil Aviation at the airport, and I got my pilot's license. Next day, we flew down to the South Coast to a airstrip where I could learn to fly this airplane. I'd never flown that kind of airplane. The third day, we went out to the Ishkan, and we made one landing at all the different airstrips I would be going to. And on the fourth day, I went to work.
Now, before we launch ourselves into discovering the Ishkan and the co-op and the community there, at the time, what did you know of the Maryknoll mission in Guatemala? Obviously, Father Bill was part of that mission effort. Did he give you some background on what they were doing at the time when you agreed to work with him?
Yeah, well, beforehand, I didn't know anything about the Maryknolls. And Bill was constantly explaining what was going on, what his hopes were, what he was trying to do, as well as just the flying part of things. So I had a good idea of what the aims were for the co-op. The co-op was basically, in Guatemala, it's a agricultural society, but nobody has any land, or most people don't have enough land to support themselves. So the idea of this co-op was to give people a big enough farm that they could support a family. And the idea of the co-op was that the land was owned by the co-op, so that you couldn't, alcohol is a problem. A guy would get drunk and sell his land, and this was to prevent that kind of thing and to protect the land for all the people. And so that's why it was put in the form of a co-op.
Did Bill tell you about how the Maryknolls were able to sort of acquire this quite significant territory for this co-op project, or did you have some background on how they were able to sort of negotiate that with the Guatemalan regime at the time? I understand that it was a multi-year process, correct?
Yeah, that's true. It had gone on for years. It was actually started by another Maryknoller, Ed Doheny. But there's a lot of the land, a lot of the titles to a lot of the land went back to documents from the King of Spain. And I remember once going with David Holstegi, who was doing he was sort of the man Friday for Bill, looking up boundaries on these thick, old, dusty wooden wood cover bound books. And it would say, from the big ceiba tree over to such and such a river, over to another arroyo, and back to the ceiba tree. And it was difficult to find the boundaries because the rivers had changed. The ceiba tree, had died in the last several hundred years. But there was another very interesting thing. Land which has no title or no owner was called Baldío land. And Bill got the government to give the co-op all the Baldío land within the boundaries of the cooperative. And he also got grants. A lot came from Germany, some from the States, to buy land that they could find the title to. Some people didn't even know they had land out there until Dave wanted to buy it from them. Nobody had gone out there. It was totally uninhabited.
So once again, just to sort of help sort of build this out for our listeners, and because this is important to, I think, the story, the Maryknolls are a Catholic mission within the church, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so the early pioneers of the Maryknoll priesthood in Guatemala, Padre Eduardo and then Padre Guillermo, aka Father Bill, what they sought to do to try and uplift the Guatemalan poor by providing them land, so they were no longer bound as essentially slave labor for the vast majority of landowners in Guatemala at the time, correct?
Yeah, that would be very correct. The Marino entrance to Guatemala, you have to check, but I think this is correct, that we had sponsored, we being United States, under the Dulles brothers and President Eisenhower, fomented a coup in Guatemala in the 50s. And the elected president was deposed. He had been in favor of land reform, and he was getting land from United Fruit Company, who owned thousands of acres on the south coast of Guatemala. And there was financial involvement in that company by the Dulles brothers, who were head of the CIA and Secretary of State in the United States. So they made this coup, put a colonel, just installed him by force as the new president. And the Catholic Church, the leaders of the Catholic Church were ultra conservative, and they welcomed this coup because the other guy was seen as having communist leanings. And as a result of that, the church was giving more of a free hand than it had had. And they invited in the Marinols. And I always felt that was like sort of letting in the Trojan horse, because here was this conservative people, conservative government, and they invited in a really radical, for those days, group of missionaries, which were the Marinols, and they started all kinds of projects like bills, human rights programs, and so on and so on.
Thank you for taking us into a little bit of the history of Guatemala that eventually led to the co-op. You do go into it in greater detail in your book, and I encourage readers to dive into the book to get some more background on that. So I understand that the co-op was initiated in 1969. You arrived in 1972. So it was, again, in the very early days. I was reading through your book, and one thing that sort of jumps out at me in many of your interviews was how wild and untamed the land was at the time. What was your first impressions when you first visited the Ishkan with Father Bill?
Well, I was pretty nervous. I was fresh out of flying school. I had really no experience, a couple hundred hours. And so I was scared for the first 100 hours of flying down there. When I'm afraid, my knees bounce up and down on the rudder pedals. And every landing for 100 hours, I'm sure my knees were going up and down. What eventually became the co-op was about a third there when I arrived. There were 3 airstrips. One had been there since the time of Eduardo. One Bill had built, and one was just barely completed. The rest, and people were starting to settle and open up their little farms. Later, 3 more airstrips were built, but when I first came, that was just pure jungle. There was nothing there. It had all been inhabited historically by the Mayan culture, but that had ended about 900. I'm not sure about this, but I'm guessing about the year 900 years ago, or the year 900. I can't remember, but like the farmers would find pot shards and things like that. But it was essentially all virgin jungle.
I was reading through your book, and I had the impression that settlers came to the co-op from all parts of Guatemala, but you had many people from indigenous communities in the surrounding area also take part in this co-op, correct?
Well, I would say that's exactly the wrong emphasis. 90% of the people were indigenous, and they mostly came from the highlands of Guatemala above the area of Ishkan. There was about 10% that were Ladino. The word Ladino up here, well, it varies around the world, but it often means Jewish people who were expelled from Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella. But in Guatemala, that means someone of more Spanish descent and less Indian descent. So about 90% of the people in the co-op were from several different linguistic groups, but all indigenous groups.
And going back to your experiences as a young and fairly new pilot, you mentioned that those first forays for the co-op were at times nerve-wracking for you. But prior to your trip to Guatemala, you served a tour in Vietnam. I'm sure that sort of helped steel your nerves in some fashion.
Well, I suppose it did. I mean, Vietnam was, well, it definitely affected your outlook on life, and so on. But it wasn't, we weren't really getting along with the people of Vietnam. It wasn't quite the same situation.
I understand. And just not to go too far back into your background and away from the book, but during your tour in Vietnam, were you with the Air Force?
No, I was in the Navy. I was on a riverboat down in the Delta south of Saigon.
I see. So returning back to the Ishkan, I understand that you were not flying by yourself, that there were several pilots who were flying with Father Bill at the time, including yourself, who were trying to sort of help this co-op get underway. Could you tell me a little bit about your co-pilots, the people that you flew with at the time?
Well, I was flying primarily for Bill's co-op. There was a Spanish priest, Luis Gurriaran, who had a much smaller co-op nearby. And so maybe one day a week I would fly for him, or one day every 2 weeks. So then a pilot came down from the States, Sink Manning, from an organization called Wings of Hope, which is a non-sectarian humanitarian flying organization out of St. Louis. And so he flew all of Luis's stuff, and then would come over and help us because Luis didn't have enough traffic. He eventually damaged his airplane, and Bill bought it and fixed it up. And so Sink sort of came under Bill's umbrella a little bit. The second plane came down from Wings of Hope with a guy named Stan Eschman. And he was training a third pilot when a rudder pedal disconnected on the airplane, and they damaged it, and Bill bought that one. So all these guys ended up kind of as a group flying for both projects. And then there was another man, Jan Stork, who came. He had really more experience than all of us. He was a crop duster. He hadn't flown a lot in the jungle, but he was a good pilot. And he was the only one married, and he got killed, which was a big blow to all of us.
So there were dangers involved in flying in Guatemala, and indeed, I think that including your colleague John Stork, who passed away in a crash, Father Bill also died in a crash under allegedly mysterious circumstances. There several interviewees in your book expressed skepticism that he crashed just by accident, but there were dangers involved in flying in Guatemala at the time. Could you tell me what were some of the challenges and dangers that you and your colleagues faced flying for the co-op at the time?
Well, the terrain, first of all, it was the highest terrain in Guatemala, the mountains that we flew over. We would fly from the highlands up over the mountains and then down to the jungle area of Ishkan. And it was pretty wild. The first airplane I flew was awful. It had very few instruments, had no gas gauges. You would measure the gas with a wooden stick, and then you'd know you had whatever, an hour and a half of fuel, and you just had to use your watch. had no navigation lights. Yeah, it was a mess. But later things improved. But the other big problem was the weather. I mean, obviously, if there's jungle, there's a lot of rain, and so the weather made things very difficult. The airstrips were pretty bad, but they were as good as they could be. They were all built by hand. Guys would chop down trees by hand, and they would make like a road grader out of a board. And about 100 guys made a rope out of vine and would pull this board. And that's how they leveled the runways after they cleared the trees. And then we would pay kids to pick grass seed off the grass on existing runways and just make a low pass over the new runway, which was just dirt, spray the seeds out the window. And in 2 or 3 weeks, you had the beginnings of a grass airstrip.
Now, we've been talking at length about the flying mission that you undertook for the co-op and Father Bill. What we haven't discussed is what exactly you guys were flying for. What were the reasons Father Bill needed pilots like yourself to assist in helping build the co-op?
Well, there were 2 ways to get to the Ishkan. One was to take a bus to the end of to the last stop, last town. That took about 13 hours. And then you'd ride in the back of a pickup truck for about 5 hours to get to the end of you could call it a road, between a track and a road. And then you would walk for 2 days to get to the very edge of the Ishkan, of the cooperative, and then walk for a couple more days to get to wherever you were going within the co-op. Alternatively, you could fly with us for 30 or 40 minutes. And so we flew people moving out. There was often, people just camped out at the runway up in the highlands. And we could never get ahead. So then we would make the men and the boys walk, and we'd carry the women and the small children and their cargo. And then we also carried all the cargo for the co-op had a general store. And so we'd fly, machetes, barbed wire, salt, sugar, cigarettes, axes, everything you'd see on an unmechanized farm, we flew. The people had no cash, no money. So eventually, as they started growing stuff, there was no market for them to sell it out in the Ishkan. So the co-op would buy their products, which were mainly corn and beans and later cardamom. It's not economical to fly corn and beans, but if the airplane's going empty, you might as well throw some in. So we would fly out of the jungle with their agricultural products and sell them up in the highlands. And to give you an idea of the economics, everybody had to pay. The people were very poor, but they still had to pay to go on the airplane. And the going rate was $3 100 pounds. So you and all your stuff got on the scale, and whatever the scale said, that was your fare. So then with the agricultural products, we kind of worked backwards with the price. Whatever we sold it for up in the highlands, we took out 50 cents, I think, for the co-op for like overhead. We took out $3 100 pounds for the airplanes, and whatever number was left, that's what the people got paid for their corn and beans. Later, cardamom became sort of a little gold mine. Cardamom is a spice used a lot, not so much in the States, but in Arab countries. And at the time, it was worth a fortune. And even if you were a commercial airplane company, you could make money flying cardamom. That was a great thing for the people when that came online.
And in addition to assisting with ferrying material, people, and produce back and forth from the Ishkan to elsewhere in Guatemala, you also sort of served as a sort of an ambulance in the sky, correct? So when people were grievously ill, you and your colleagues would fly them to a hospital in the surrounding area, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We were the local ambulance service, and that wasn't a huge amount of work for us, but it was, I think, a huge psychological benefit for people to know that there was a way for them to get out to medical care, such as it was.
Yes, indeed. In fact, in several of your interviews, what really sort of gets across is just what an incredible mission it was just to get to the co-op in Ishkan. As you said earlier, it involved many days of travel. So I'm sure that the fact that people, once they arrived, they knew if something were to happen, there was a means to get out quickly. It must have helped shore up confidence, as you said. But these were a remarkable 3 years for you, Mike. You were there from 1972 to 1975. Indeed, many sort of the interviews from the book originates from this really sort of crucial time in your life and time spent working for Father Bill in the co-op. I understand that eventually in 1975 you went back to the States for school. What was the decision-making process for you to decide that now was the time to put this experience behind you for the moment and return back to the States for school?
Well, I wasn't dead yet, and I thought it was time to get out while I was still kicking. And I went back to school to get an aircraft mechanics license. I decided if I was going to do this kind of work, I really had to know what made the airplane tick. Pilots are remarkably ignorant about the inner workings of aircraft often. So I came up to the States, went to school for a year to get an airplane mechanics license.
And so you mentioned that you weren't dead yet, and that was one reason you decided to go back. Is that because around this time the Ishkan was getting more dangerous as conflict was brewing between a resurgent guerrilla force and the regime's army?
Well, no, there had been a revolution in the 60s, which was quashed by the government. And then the next revolution or war that the people often talked about in the book, that hadn't really started yet. But I could see guys, sitting with their heads close together and talking and whispering. And that was like the planning for the next uprising, and I just avoided that. I had been to Vietnam. One war was enough. I didn't think that I thought starting a war wasn't really going to help people much, and so I avoided that. But no, that wasn't why I left. The violence really hadn't started yet.
And you're talking about the beginnings of the guerrilla army of the poor, correct?
Yes. They were just in the sort of talking about it stage, as far as I know. And no, I left because, the fun was dangerous, and it was just time for a break from that.
Is that one reason why you decided to pursue that sort of educational degree once you left Dishkan, having flown these sort of fragile airplanes that frequently required maintenance and were difficult to handle, as you said, that some of them didn't have oil gauges and what have you?
Yeah, well, things got better while I was down there. The first airplane was the worst. But when John Stork was killed, well, no one really knows what happened. Well, he flew into the mountain, but we don't know why. And you would leave the highlands and try and climb sort of paralleling a high mountain ridge. And the weather had to be what we call visual flight rules. You had to be able to see on one side of the mountains or the other because there was no instrument approaches. And so you would climb parallel to the mountains, and there were three little, not even lakes, big ponds on the side of the mountain. And after the third one, if you continued straight ahead for 30 seconds and turned left, went into the clouds, you knew you were in the pass. And John crashed about 30 seconds after the second lake, and he may have thought he was at the third. And also, that plane had some problems with the magnetos, which is what on the airplane what's make the spark plug spark. And whatever it was, they resolved it, and off he went. And Bill had gone back to the States for a year, and I was a little bit in charge. And it's always haunted me, this second and third lake problem or the magneto problem, and it really affected me for the rest of my career. I became a real stickler. If an airplane wasn't perfect, it just didn't go out. We just canceled the trip.
And I understand that John's wife, Deborah, has remained lifelong friends with you and your family, correct? Since that tragic
Yeah,
crash.
yeah, that's true. She likes New Mexico, and she comes out and stays in our house often in the summertime.
Jumping ahead a little bit, so in 1975, you decided to go back to school. It sort of took you on a journey that brought you to many different parts of the world. But according to what I read in the book, you did return in 1989 to make a documentary about the co-op. Could you tell me a little bit about that documentary, why you made it?
Well, yeah, after I got my mechanic's license, the government had closed down the flying operation in Guatemala. I think they were getting ready for the repression, and they were getting rid of the witnesses, really. And so I got a job flying for a medical project in Tanzania, was there for about a year. And then I went to New Guinea, Irian Jaya, which is the Indonesian part of the island of New Guinea. Flew there for about 3 years. And that was like 5.5 days a week, which was so I did that for 3 years, and I was pretty burned out. And I came home and I went back. I went to school, actually, here in Santa Fe. There was a school called the Anthropology Film Center, and it was about documentary filmmaking in the third world. Ideas about, you're a gringo and you're filming in a place, whether it's up on the Navajo or whether it's in Central America or Africa, and to try at least to not make your biases influence what you're recording. And so after that school, I needed to work again. So I went up to Alaska and flew for a couple of years. And then I went down to the Ishkan to try and make a documentary. Well, I guess I left out that after the mechanic school, I went to work for the Cousteau Society flying a seaplane. And so that was really my introduction to the world of film. Even though I was flying, I was around a filmmaking project all the time. And so then so with those two backgrounds, I eventually went back to the Ishkan to make a documentary. Some was in the Ishkan. It was pretty much uninhabited at the time because of all the violence. So I filmed a little bit in the Ishkan and a little bit in refugee camps up in Mexico.
What was the story of this documentary about?
Well, it was not totally unlike the book. It was a little bit history of the Ishkan, more narration, I suppose, on my part, and then interviews with people I could find. We went out to a village that had been destroyed completely. Well, all the villages had been destroyed completely, but I walked out to one with a guy who had lived there and interviewed him in front of a military camp. And he's talking about having lived there. He pointed out the corner posts of his house that were all that was left. And I was having a heart attack because all these really young soldiers were leaning over his shoulder listening to all this. And I thought he was, committing suicide. And as we walked back from this military camp, I asked him, and he said, no, you listen. I never said who burned down the town. I never mentioned the army once. And if they say anything to me, I can say, no, it was probably the guerrilla. So all those people were sharp, really, and careful.
One thing that really sort of stands out in your book, reading through it and hearing from your interviewees about the troubled times heading into the late 70s and early 80s, when really violence began to break out in the region between the army, the guerrillas, consequently, the civilian population that got caught in between this conflict. One of the things that stood out for me is it was hard for many people to talk about what had happened to them in their community. Going back to people being sharp, you had this sense that, in fact, some of the interviews that you held, some of the people said that the conflict really isn't over. It's just simply subsided for the time being.
Well, I think that's true. One man said to me, back in the 80s, we knew who was doing the killing. And now people are still being killed or disappeared, and we're not sure who is doing it. And I think as long as the economic imbalance, social imbalance continues, there'll be strife.
One of the fascinating things about your book, and this is one reason why I'm so glad to, get you on this interview is how things connect. Like for your documentary, you interviewed, I think at the time, a young boy named Ramon Mendoza Ramirez, and you were able to reconnect with him in 2010 and re-interview him for the book. And I think that's really a credit to you as a journalist, documentary maker, that you were able to make these connections over great spans of time. Was it difficult finding Ramon?
Well, you're giving more credit than I do. I had no idea that he was the kid in that interview until he mentioned it in the second interview for the book. It was just pure serendipity that it was him. But it brings up an interesting thing. The first interview, I was frustrated because I was filming on 16 millimeter film and it's expensive. And here's this kid sitting on a log and I'm trying to get him to say something and he's not saying anything. Well, it turned out he couldn't speak Spanish. And he went to school for a year in Mexico, just guessing what the teacher was trying to say, and eventually learned Spanish. When I went down there in the 70s, I could almost talk to no women because the women stayed home and they only spoke their indigenous language, which of course I didn't know. About, I don't know what percentage, but a percentage of the men spoke some Spanish because they had worked as migrant labor throughout Guatemala, mostly on cotton and coffee plantations. So it was really limited who I could talk to. And when I interviewed Guatemalan women for the film in Mexico, I was able to talk to quite a few of them because in Mexico they learned Spanish. They were forced out of their villages and so on, and they just had to talk to people around who were Mexicans speaking Spanish. So then I went back to Guatemala in '96 and I had equal number of male and female friends because now I could talk to people. My Spanish was better, their Spanish was better, and it was a whole world that didn't exist for me in the 70s.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. It's good that you pointed out the fact that for many of the people that you first met in the early 70s, as you said, the vast majority of them who came to settle in the co-op were indigenous people from surrounding areas. And it didn't occur to me that many of them would not speak Spanish. One thing that struck me in this book as well was just how proud they were of their indigenous traditions and culture. There was one interviewee talking about his wife, and they had to flee to Mexico to escape the violence. And his wife swore that she would never give up her corta. Is that how you say it in Spanish? It's like a traditional attire.
Corte.
Yeah. There you go. So, I think that's another thing that sort of jumped out at me while reading this book is that while many of the co-op residents came from extremely poor backgrounds, they felt that they were extremely rich in cultural heritage and really, fought hard to preserve it throughout all these years and all these troubles. I was very impressed by that.
Yeah, there's a guy, I'm trying to think, he's in the book and he was also in the film. I filmed him out in the Ishkan during not the really bad years of violence, but like a year or two after the worst of it. And he had returned on his own with his family because he felt his children were losing their culture in Mexico. So he came back basically to Mayalan and was going out to his farm and working. But now you're caught because Mayalan had an army fort. The army was, you had to do what they said. And on the other hand, all the surrounding area was controlled by the guerrilla. And they felt that he's probably a spy because the army's letting him live there. And they shot him. Didn't kill him, they shot him in the leg. And his two friends were also shot. None of them were killed, but they were all shot. And so here's a guy who had fled the army. The army burned his town down. He was a refugee in Mexico. He came back and he's under the thumb of the army. There's only like 5 or 6 families there. Everybody else was long gone. And he gets shot by the guerrilla. It's just, I don't know. It's mind-boggling. But he's still a member of the community. And he must not have been a collaborator in any serious sense of the word, or he would never have been allowed to stay when the people came back. And he's a a leading member of the community.
Yeah, there is a great irony in what happened to him. I remember reading that interview and it having stood out for me because his story was the exception rather than the rule. For the most part, what I took away from these interviews was that the army, through their early brutality in terms of trying to sort of root out guerrillas from amongst the co-op community in Ixcan, they pushed the overwhelming majority of civilians into sympathizing and supporting the guerrillas who they saw eventually as protectors against the army. Is that something that came across to you over the course of these interviews?
Well, yeah. I mean, there were a lot of guerrillas amongst the people. There were also a lot of people who didn't think that was a good idea. But they got massacred. Whole villages were shot. It took them, in a town called Cuarto Pueblo, it took them 3 days to kill everybody. They surrounded the place, and well, that's an awful story. Anyway, they were all killed. And but then, I'm just amazed at the ironies of these things. Later, I went back down in '96. The people asked me if I would come back and fly when they returned. And it wasn't quite the same, nothing like a little war to start hostility between neighbors. But I had to go to the city and I had to take a co op member. He was one of the leaders of one of the small co-ops. And this was not the same kind of guy that had been there in the 70s. These guys were very sort of mercenary and looking out for themselves and so on. It wasn't the big spirit of cooperation. But anyway, we went to this meeting and he was very hostile towards the guerrillas. He was very hostile towards the Spanish priest who had that other co-op that we flew for. And I was kind of taken aback. And afterwards, I asked him why he was so hostile when it was the army that burned the place down, including his town. And he said to me, the guerrilla promised to protect us, and they never did. And it was just like cold water in my face. The guerrilla didn't protect them because they couldn't. They just didn't have the firepower. And the war ended up, the guerrilla eventually got a little more arms, not much, but more. And it ended up in a stalemate. The army was in these forts. I use the word fort. If you imagine a sandbag wall about 3 feet high, and then sandbag hooches inside, that's a fort. That's all the army had, really. But they had air power. And so the army couldn't leave their little forts. If they went out into the jungle, the guerrilla would kill them. And the guerrilla wasn't strong enough to conquer a fort, and so the last few years of the war was a stalemate. Earlier, the army made huge sweeps through the area, with battalions of soldiers chasing the civilians who were hiding in the jungle for 12 or 14 years. But eventually, they weren't able to do that, and everybody realized it was a stalemate, and so finally they signed a peace treaty or a ceasefire.
Another element of your book that really sort of has left an impression with me was the great detail in which your interviewees talked about the experience of joining what they called the CPR. I would massacre the Spanish pronunciation of the name, but the translation comes out to communities of the people in resistance in English. And, going back to what you said about the guerrillas not being able to protect the civilian community, while that was true, one thing that, again, was sort of repeated in several of your interviews was how this community, the CPR, fled into the jungle to escape the violence of the army and had to collaborate and work with the guerrillas to survive. They weren't necessarily part of the guerrilla force, the guerrilla army of the poor, but they were both sort of in the jungle of Ishkan at the same time, both of them trying to avoid army patrols in the jungle. I found that fascinating. Is that true? I mean, were they largely separate sort of organizations that were just sort of in the same area at that time, or was there more linkages between them?
I think, on the one side there was the army, well, and then totally on the other side was the guerrilla, and then there was the civilian communities. But if you're being hunted by the army and the guerrilla is opposing the army, it's hard to not be friends with the guerrilla. But there's a huge gray area. A lot of people were pacifists. and didn't want to fight for the army, didn't want to fight for the guerrilla.
That's right.
And they were in the CPR. A lot of people, the guerrilla would come into the communities for food sometimes. Well, I'm sure often. And the government, of course, accuses the community of supporting the guerrilla. That was their argument. There was one interview, I thought the most profound interview was from a guy named, let me think, Gonzalo Ross. And he was really trapped between, he's a classic example. He had starved as a kid. He actually joined the way the army recruits. They bring a few pickup trucks into a village. They grab the kids, 16 to 18 years old, throw them in the back of the truck, and that's the draft. So when the people hear army trucks coming, all the kids flee. Well, he was more or less starving in his village. He said, if my father got work that day, we ate. If he didn't, we didn't eat. So he went out and stood on the corner so the army would pick him up so he could get food. So he did his tour. I don't know how long it was, maybe a couple of years. I really have no idea. He got out of the army and he went back to his day-to-day, hand-to-mouth existence. And then he came out to the Ishkan. So when the war started, he wanted nothing to do with either side. He didn't want to be a guerrilla. He didn't want to carry a gun. He didn't want, everybody's afraid of the army. But you can't do that. You got to pick a team. You got to choose sides. So they said, well, your choices are to be a guerrilla, which he didn't want to do, or you can sort of be a half guerrilla and take food, and he did, or you can be a civilian in the CPR, the Communities in Resistance. And so he's kind of negotiating what to do, and he wasn't going to be allowed to live on his farm anymore by the guerrilla. He had to move out and either go to Mexico or go back to his home. And so he was trying to decide what to do. And what finally decided him during the negotiations of what part of the CPR he would join, they said, do you have any children? And he said, yeah, I have 2 or 3 boys. And they said, oh, good, future guerrillas. And that sort of snapped inside him. And so he fled back to his old hometown in the Highlands, which was also in a state of siege, although there was a lot of killing, but they weren't destroying whole villages. And so here's a guy, he's fleeing now from the guerrilla, he's fleeing from the army for being basically a pacifist. And I think I met him up in the Highlands while I was working on the film, but fleetingly, and I wasn't going to film in the Highlands, but I talked to him a little bit and he was just afraid to speak. And then when I went back for the book, he spoke, and I thought it was the most profound of all the interviews.
Well, I would encourage readers to seek his interview out in your book. So how did you come up with the title of your book?
Well, I was interviewing Chepe Salas, and he told me that in the late 70s, early 80s, the people were trying to get the word out to the press of what was happening out in the Ishkan. But the newspapers were all intimidated and afraid to print anything. So a group of people, not only Chepe, but people from some of the unions, workers' unions, and so on, decided to take over an embassy, and that way they thought the foreign press will have to listen to our complaints. We'll get some publicity. So they took over the Spanish embassy, and I'm trying to remember the lady who won the Nobel Prize. Her father was burnt in the embassy. The Guatemalan response was to burn the Spanish embassy down. It killed 28 peasants and 8 diplomats from Spain. And Chepe was on his way to that. They were in an old crappy car, and the car broke down on the Periférico, the beltway for Guatemala City. By the time they got to the embassy, it was already surrounded by army and police. And so he couldn't get in, and that's why he wasn't burned. And he said to me, yeah, it was not our day to die. And that's where the title came from.
Well chosen. Do you remember where you were when you first heard about the burning of the Spanish embassy?
1980. I was overseas somewhere. I didn't hear about it until long after it had happened.
And how did you go about selecting the people for your interviews in the book?
Well, some I knew quite well. Some I'd worked with back in the 70s. And so I went to them first. And then they might suggest someone else, and they might suggest someone else. And I just interviewed as many as I could in the time that I was there. That was in 2010 and 2011.
And approximately how much time did you have on the ground to record these interviews?
Oof, I don't know. I guess, you spend half your time traveling. The roads were so bad. But I guess each time I was there about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. But only half of that would have been probably 3 weeks actually doing interviews.
And you mentioned that there was a lot of travel involved in reaching some of these interviewees. Did you have to go to far-flung parts of the Ishkan to reach some of them?
Well, a lot were in the area of Mayalan. Some were in a couple of different, what they used to call centers, or other little towns within the co-op. And it would take about a day to get from one town to the other, even though it wasn't 10, 15 miles. And then one was in another town. The people from the resistance, the people that hid in the jungle all those years, some came back to the co-ops. Some went to a different town called Primavera. They decided to stay together with the people who'd been in resistance in the jungle. And so I went to that town. It was a day's journey to get there. And then one was, the only one that wasn't in the general area was a lady who was up near Santa Elena, which is near Flores, way up in the Petén. So that was a couple days to go see her.
And which interviewee was this lady?
Bartola. And she's actually the daughter of Ana Maria, the lady who had sort of the dream from her father-in-law. That's Bartola's mother.
And is this the same young girl who would go over to your home and deliver you dinner in the evenings?
No, when I first got there, that was Maria. Yeah, Maria Matias Pablo was the girl who, as a child, used to bring me dinner. It was when I first arrived and I was just living by myself in what they called the first center, one of the first airstrips to open. Her mother, Dominga Pablo Lucas, used to cook the dinner, and Maria would bring it over. She was just a child, I don't know, 8 years old, maybe 6. And, she was terrified of the foreigner. She'd hand me the dinner and then run home as fast as she could. Her father, that's kind of an interesting story, which didn't get into the book much. They didn't want to talk about it, so I didn't ask. But her father was one of the original leaders of the co-op. And when the Army first came out, they had sort of a Hearts and Minds program. They were building storage for corn and dryers for the cardamom, things like that. And her father cooperated with those projects with the Army. But the guerrilla didn't like that. They warned him off, and he said, no, the Army's helping us, which at that time they were. And so the guerrilla killed him. And then later, the guerrilla came, or the Army came and destroyed everything. They destroyed everything they'd built. They destroyed everybody's houses. They destroyed everything Bill had built. And so this family is now on the run. Most ended up as refugees in Mexico. I met them up there in the refugee camp. The son joined the guerrilla, but it must have been awful being in the guerrilla. The Army's trying to kill you, and you know that somebody in the guerrilla ordered the shooting of your father. So I was curious about that when I was doing the interviews for the book, but nobody brought it up. And I thought, if I find out who gave that order, what am I going to do with it? What kind of good is that going to do to put that knowledge out in the public? So I didn't bring it up, and it's just not in the book, and it may never be public.
Thank you for sharing that. I had no idea that there was that additional background to Maria's story. I guess it just shows how complex that conflict was. On the one side, the community had the army breathing down their necks from the government, and on the other side, you had the guerrillas themselves putting pressure on the community, the co-op, to pick a side. I understand that Maria, she started out as a shy mouse, as a young girl, ferrying dinner back and forth to you. But she went on to become a community leader in Mexico, correct? For the diaspora.
Yeah, in Mexico, and when they came back to Guatemala, there was a women's organization called Mama Maquin, and she was the national head of that organization. She's quite a powerhouse in her own right, far removed from the little girl that used to bring me a plate of tortillas and run home.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you again for sharing that additional background on Maria and her family and the tragedy around her father's death. Speaking of coming back from Mexico and reintegrating in the Ishkan, what is the current state of the cooperative? Does it still exist? And do the Marinols still support it?
The cooperative has changed a lot. The original land titles were in the name of the co-op to keep people from losing their land through whatever, being in debt or for whatever reason. But when they came back, the unity wasn't so great as it had been before. Mayalan is still very strong, maintaining the idea of the co-op. And Shalbao was another town in the co-op. A lot of that land was lost. It was given to soldiers. And so there's tension in Shalbao between the soldiers who took that land and the people who were able to return. The last co-ops to be formed had the least, I hate to use the word indoctrination, but they were the least indoctrinated in the idea of the co-op. And that's where the idea is weakest now. There was a big meeting and they made individual titles. So the co-op doesn't own the land anymore. Each co-op member was given a title to his land. Most are probably still there. Some have sold their land. Some are now owning 2 or 3 farms. Yeah, so that's the way that goes. The Marinols have pretty much retired from Guatemala. There's only about, I think, three left down there. They moved on to other things, and then also the Marinols got old. They're starting to pass away, and there's not so many young ones joining up. So there is no Marinol presence in the co-ops at this time.
That is sad to hear, considering the good work that Padre Guillermo and his predecessor Eduardo started in the cooperative, and the great love the people of the community still have for these Marinol brothers.
But I just add, the Marinols aren't there, but the people are still there. And, as far as religion goes, the Guatemalan priests and the Spanish priests come through. They're just not as big a presence as the Marinols, but that's not as bleak as you might think. The Marinols set it up, got it running, got everybody land, and that was kind of their job. And then they hand their missions over to the local diocese.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Do you or any of your family remain in touch with people from the cooperative community to this day?
Well, we've had a history of going back. I went back, of course, to record for the book, but before that, I went down in the 90s to meet with people. I didn't go out to the CPR, population and resistance in the jungle, but I did go to Mayalan. I did go to the first center, and both of those were just, there was nobody in the first center. I wanted to see the place, and I put a grave, my excuse or my pretext for going there was to put a grave marker on the grave of the John Stork, the pilot who was killed. He was buried in First Center. Mayalan, there was maybe 4 or 5 families who had returned even though the war was still going on. The airstrip was open because the military used it. That was the status when I went there. Then I went back again for the first big return of refugees. It was a big deal. It was about 130 buses came out of Mexico. We went to Guatemala City and then to a town called Coban, and then eventually out to after Coban, the buses couldn't go. The roads were too bad. And we went in the back of 10-ton trucks. And then the very last part, we had to walk. And that was the first organized return. The refugees were very organized. They got together with the UN. They had certain demands that the army would leave the Ishkan and so on. And so they got back. The army wouldn't leave. And so people camped for a year at a crossroads and politically forced the army out and then gradually resettled all the cooperatives.
What year was the return?
Well, I can tell you what was happening. When we crossed the border from Mexico to Guatemala, Bill Clinton was giving his inaugural address.
Okay, so early 90s.
Yeah, early 90s. And the people asked me at that time, well, they had asked me even earlier if I would come back and fly when they got back. And it was doubtful that they would ever get back, but, I said yes. And then they started getting organized for this return. So I spent a year raising money to go back and fly. And I went back down to Milan with our whole family in 1996. Things were relatively peaceful. You would hear firefights off in the distance on occasion. But then they signed a ceasefire, and some months later, there was a peace accords. So the whole family, I bought 2 trees and paid a guy to saw it up and make a house out of it. That's what we lived in. And we were there for a year. And then we went back in the summers for the next 3 years. And, I would fly out of the strips. We had reopened most of the airstrips. They had trees about 8 inches in diameter, some of them. And so the people cleared them out and reopened the airstrips. One town didn't want to reopen their airstrip. They were afraid the government would use it to, they were afraid of the army, and they were afraid the army would use it. So they never reopened theirs, but all the others opened.
That return, when you accompanied the refugees coming from Mexico in that huge convoy, there must have been a strong sense of celebration amongst the refugees coming back to Guatemala. Was that the case? Did you feel a celebratory mood amongst the returnees when you were traveling with them back to the Ishkan and the cooperative?
Oh, yeah. One memory that sticks in my mind was an old man looking out the window of the bus as we were driving through the highlands of Guatemala, just tears running down his face. They were so happy to be back. And then also in the highlands, in one village, the road was green with pine needles that people had put out with as a welcoming sign for the refugees coming back. That was also a beautiful sight.
That must have been a very special experience, considering many of the returnees probably never imagined they would have the opportunity to come back. I mean, you were talking about what you found when you went back in the 80s and the total destruction of the cooperative, the community towns, was absolute. So to think that years later, they had a chance to go back and rebuild and regrow, it gives you hope when you hear stories like that.
Well, yeah, and they never gave up. When I went to the refugee camps, there was committees, local committees in the camps with representatives from all over Mexico, and they were meeting. The Mexicans told me that when these guys got to Mexico, the next day they started organizing. So whether or not, I thought they would get back, they did. And they started working towards that for day one. It took them, 12 to 16 years, but they never put that out of their mind that they wouldn't go back someday.
When it came to putting together the book, how did you make I'm sure that you recorded more than 29 interviews over the course of putting together this book. How did you go about deciding what interviews to include or exclude?
Well, I actually only did 30 interviews, and I used every interview I did except the one, and that was because when I got home, I realized I hadn't taken a photograph of the guy, and I wanted a picture with each interview. But basically, other than that guy, I used every interview. And they didn't necessarily, none of them really, well, some I knew before and I knew their stories, but the emphasis on the war was not my point. Well, let me go back a little bit. I had made a book with my brother-in-law in Afghanistan, he's a photographer. He took pictures of children, and I interviewed the children, and we made a book called Afghan Dreams. So we decided to do that on the U.S.-Mexico border with kids from Mexico, kids from the States, and kids trying to cross the border. And we started in Juarez. We had good contacts, people working with, youth groups and children, but they were all working with kids who were too young to really express themselves. Except for one school that we went to, all the kids were too young, and I just wasn't getting any interviews. And this guy who was introducing us to these various organizations I had known in Guatemala, he said, what you should do is go back to the Ishkan and interview the elders, not the children. And so that's kind of what his little comment was, what sent me back to the Ishkan to interview the elders. And all I would ask is, do you remember when you first came out to the Ishkan? And then I just let them go. And on a rare occasion, I asked a further question because it was somebody I knew, and I knew part of their story that they hadn't mentioned. And so some of them, oh yeah, and they would tell me that. One or two said, no, we can't talk about that anymore. And so that's not in the book, those episodes. But basically, everybody I interviewed is in the book, and they just said what they had to say, and I gave very little prompting, just let them go on. Some talked for an hour, some talked for 10 minutes.
Yeah, that sort of comes across in the book. Some of the interviewees, their particular interviews run many pages, whilst others only run for one or two, depending upon, I guess, how long they wanted to talk to you on the record. That I didn't know about the origins of your book, the fact that partly the reason why Not Our Day to Die, you undertook this book project was because of an earlier effort that you undertook with your brother-in-law, Tony O'Brien. You shared with us partly where the inspiration came to write this book. But in addition to this person suggesting that you go down to talk to people from the co-op community, 30 or 40 years since you were first there, what drove you personally to make the effort to go down there and record these interviews in 2010?
Well, a lot of people who've worked in the foreign service or led lives like me, I don't know, I've read that they often say their favorite posting was the first place they went. And, Guatemala, I was, relatively young, I suppose more impressionable, and it just made a huge impression upon me. And the idea of the co-op did. And so I've always wanted to return. I've always, sometimes I went 10 years or even 15 without contact, but it was always on my mind. I just kept going back.
It's interesting that you say that, and I can see why this community might have left such an impression upon you. Going back to, that first question that you asked many of these interviewees, why did you go to the Ishkan? You get this sense of overwhelming hope and promise for a new start from almost everyone that you spoke to. Every one of them spoke about the hardship of working on the fincas for a patron for nothing. I don't know if I said that correctly. Fincas and patron. Is that how you pronounce that?
Patron, but everything else was correct.
Yeah, you get the sense that, they were all trapped in slave labor-like occupations on these plantations. I think one of your interviews really poignantly said it. He spoke to his wife saying that he's sort of repeating the same thing that his father did, working basically just for survival. And the co-ops offered a chance for every single one of your interviewees to build their own life. And I can imagine that for those 3 years that you were there before the troubles began, there must have been this sort of celebratory mood in the communities at the time. Is that something that sort of stuck with you, or was that true? I mean, as far as the reading is concerned?
Well, it was. It's hard for me now. I can talk to all these people. When I went down there, all I could say was, good morning, how are you? So I was learning Spanish, and I was working pretty hard. We flew whenever we could, weather permitting. But there was this great spirit. Like I mentioned, building the runways. I walked out to a runway that was under construction. About half the trees were knocked down, and there were about 15 guys went out to work, and I helped carry a chainsaw. There was this 10-year-old kid carrying a chainsaw. And the way they carry things, it's called a mecapal. They put a strap on their forehead. They don't have a backpack per se, but the strap on your forehead goes down behind your back, and there's huge loads on that. So here's this 10-year-old kid carrying a pretty big chainsaw. And so, being 20-something-year-old young guy, I thought I'd help him. And I put the strap on my forehead, and I carried it for about an hour. And I felt like I had nails in my neck, and it was very humiliating. I had to give it back to the 10-year-old kid. But the point was that these guys did all this stuff. You had to donate a certain amount of labor to the co-op. It was just part of the deal. And so part of that labor was maybe surveying to lay out the lines, boundary lines for the future farms. Part of it was building runways just out of the jungle. Part of it was building. Each town grew up around an airstrip, and each town had a building, which was 3 or 4 rooms. One was a room for us to stay if we had to spend the night. One was a clinic. One room was like the co-op general store. And one room was for this guy, David Holstegi, who was a former marine to do his work, which was running the surveyors, purchasing the stuff for the store. He kind of made everything work. And so another form of labor would be sawing boards out of trees to build these co-op buildings, things like that. And it was all, there was no forced labor. When people came, they had to live with someone for, I think, 6 months, and then the co-op decided whether or not to accept them into the cooperative. Some sort of vote. I never really saw it happening, but then once they were accepted, they would draw numbers out of a hat and get a plot of land, a farm. And there was just this wonderful spirit, of progress. And it was people who, the first time they had a chance in their life, and everybody was working hard. There was very little, I'm sure there was strife, but very little.
So one thing that made me smile a little bit while reading about the early days of the co-op and some of the people that you interviewed and their memories of visiting the Ishkan and going to the co-op for the first time, almost universally, the women you interviewed, many of them expressed dismay at what they initially found at the co-op when their husbands dragged them over there.
Oh, yeah, there was one she's a woman now, but she was a young girl, and her father told her there'd be buses and movie theaters and all kinds of stuff. And she was bitterly disappointed. And another who was older, a mother by then, she said, we promised all these things. All there was snakes, wild pigs, and mosquitoes.
And jaguars.
Jaguars, yeah.
What those sort of interviews communicated to me was just what a frontier experience it must have been for everyone who was trying to sort of make a life for themselves in the co-op. How in those early days, it was essentially, as you said, a really remote part of Guatemala, hard to reach, largely untouched by human labor.
Yeah, it was, it was jungle that had grown up over, I don't know, 1,000 years or so. I suspect that whole area was, I hate to use the word civilized, was developed in the time of the Mayan cultures before Columbus. But it had, I think, died out even before Columbus, and the jungle had taken over.
It's fascinating to think of a part of the world like that. It's essentially been forgotten by the humans for hundreds of years. Returning to the hard labor of putting together this book, could you tell us a little bit about the writing process? Who translated the interviews from Spanish to English for you?
Well, I did the original translation. There were a lot of holes in it of words I couldn't understand, or words I didn't know, or words that weren't in the dictionary. And so then I had all kinds of help with people. One of the Marino fathers helped me with one interview. There's a lady from Guatemala here in Santa Fe. She helped me with some. some dreamers from down near El Paso. Those kids helped me with some, but then what was interesting, their mother and their aunt, who came from farms in Mexico, they helped a lot because they said, oh, no, that's not really a Spanish word, but we have the same word and it means such and such, and it would be a farm animal or an agricultural term. And so it went reasonably well. There was one guy who was really difficult, and I translated it as best I could. And I actually, the Marino father who had been helping me, he said, oh, I'll come by your house and I'll help you. And he listened to the first sentence and shook his head and said, we're in trouble. And so I went back. I had gone down in 2010, and when I went back in 2011, I re-interviewed him and asked him specific questions that I couldn't understand. And thank God I did, because that guy I would have had all wrong.
Can I ask which interview that was?
Jose, I'll think of his last name.
Jose Diaz Perez?
Yeah. I went down in November of last year, and I at least took an English book to all the people I'd interviewed. And I went with my daughter and a Guatemalan friend of mine. We drove her car, and we stayed with Jose in the town of, well, the village of Mayalan. And when we left, the Guatemalan lady says, I was in the house with Jose all weekend. I never understood a word he said. So I didn't feel so bad about my Spanish.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm looking at David's interview right now. And one of the things that gets across in several of these interviews was the impression that Father Bill, the impression that he left on many of the people. They just cannot say how thankful they were for his work providing them this land and this community. And his sacrifice for the co-op and the people of the co-op. But Jose, he goes into length about the impressions that people like yourself and your colleague David left on the community. You get the sense that all the gringos that showed up to help with this this sort of vision that the Marino fathers had, that you get this palpable sense of what's the right word for it? Gratitude from many of your interviews when they talk about these memories that they had. Did that mean something to you, hearing them 20, 30 years since you were flying in that area, hear them talk about, the impact that you and your colleagues had on their lives?
Well, sure, of course, it's gratifying. But in reality, I think I got a lot more from them than they got from me. It's just that my work was more visible. The airplane going around and taking out somebody sick makes a big impression. But they impressed me more than I impressed them.
Now, you took us a little bit through the process of translating these interviews from Spanish to English, and I didn't realize that it was such a large project for you and that involved so many people assisting you with the translation work. Once you had those translations, once those interviews have been transcribed, what about the writing of it? Was it a word for word thing for you, or did you have to sort of mold some of the interviews to make them a little bit more coherent? Could you tell us a little bit about the writing process for yourself as the author, putting down these interviews to page?
Well, first I transcribed it literally. I probably got 80 to 90% transcribed, and then had help with 5%, and then 5% was really a struggle because of words that were local, that weren't used elsewhere. And so then the next step, people, I let people just ramble on. Probably not a good interviewing technique, but I just let them talk. And so I was a little bit stream of consciousness. And so what I did do was I moved paragraphs around. If they would talk about something and then talk about something else and then go back to the first thing, well, I arranged things by subject matter. And did that in a little bit chronological order. If they talked about something that happened early at the end of the interview, I moved it up to the front. So I did shift things around, but then when it came time to write it out, it's pretty much word for word what they said. It's not my words at all. It's theirs.
So there was a lot of work involved in taking the transcriptions and then ordering them to make them more of a coherent read for yourself and for your readers.
Yeah, there was a lot of that. In fact, now I'm working on editing the audio from the transcription or from the interviews and putting that in the same order that it appears in the book. I'm trying to get it out in Spanish down in Guatemala. And so it's one thing, somebody could just translate the book back into Spanish, but I think it would be good to be able to listen to the people talk and also read the book, use the two sources, and then write it in Spanish. The writing in Spanish is a little tricky because this is the way the indigenous languages work. You learn your local language, and then you learn the language of the more dominant Mayan tribe or group. And then you learn Spanish. So for everybody, it was their second language. And for a lot of people, it was their third language. And so their Spanish isn't necessarily the best. So in English, that wasn't a problem because I just wrote down what I knew they were trying to say. But in Spanish, you have to clean it up a little or they're going to sound uneducated and maybe not stupid, but backwards. But if you clean it up too much, you lose the spirit and the sense of the people. So that's I think it'd be harder to listen to the interviews and write it in Spanish for a general public than it would have been to do it in English.
That is very interesting. I had no idea that you are making use of the actual audio you recorded and adapting that into an audio book to sort of accompany this book, Not Our Day to Die. Where are you in the development of that project?
Oh, I've done about 3 or 4 interviews. I'm really just getting started. I was under pressure. There was this wonderful guy. He's a very well-educated Jesuit priest down in Guatemala. He's an anthropologist, and he's actually mentioned in the book because he went out and lived with the people in the CPR, the people in communities in resistance. And I asked him if he would write, I sent him I don't know, I guess you'd call it the galleys of the book, and asked him if he would write a little thing. And what I hoped was one of those little quotes you put on the back cover, this is the neatest book in the world and you should buy it. And he wrote this wonderful log thing, which is in the book. It's the introduction. And so I went to see him in November, and he said, well, you're taking these books to these people, but they're in English. It's like giving them a dulce, a piece of candy that they can't eat. And he'd been pushing me for years to get it in Spanish, but that little remark really pushed me to get started on this Spanish version.
When could we expect to see the audiobook published?
Well, I don't know if it'll be an audiobook. I'm doing in film school, when I learned, it was 16 millimeter film and the audio was on a 1/2-inch tape, and you cut it with a razor and spliced it together. And now everything is, of course, on a computer. And so I'm working with a computer program that is a little bit beyond me technically. And so it's going slow, but what I'm doing is putting it in order, the audio, and I'm not really doing a fine cut. I'm letting their oohs and ahs stay in there. It's really for the translators to help them, say, well, what was this guy really saying? And they can listen to it. But I've had the thought that even though it's not a finished audio product, I would like to put it on a disc and give it to the people. They won't mind the pops and the squeals and the pauses. They'll be fascinated to hear themselves or now their parents or grandparents speaking. I think it'll be wonderful for them.
But incredible project. I'm glad that you shared with us that's something that you're currently working on. So how did you go about ordering the interviews in the written book?
I found a local book publisher, and the guy, I thought I had it pretty well edited because so many friends had read it and edited it, made corrections. And so I found a local company called Terra Books. And their editor was wonderful. I thought I was done, and he said, no, you're not. And we went back and forth, mostly by email, for a few months. And he just, it was wonderful. There's things that I thought were intuitive. He said, well, nobody up here knows about that. You have to explain it and so on. And so anyway, the Terra is the publisher. They've put it out. You can buy it in a bookstore or from me or from this Terra. You generally have to order it. It's not always on the shelf, I'm sad to say.
Well, it is available on Amazon. So it can be
on Amazon.
It can be ordered off Amazon for people that don't have access to a bookstore that carries it. But otherwise, as you said, it is carried by Terra. Going back to the editor, what was one of the most important sort of contributions he did to the ordering of the book, in your opinion?
Well, I don't know if it was the ordering. It was just clarifying things. And I had used some words, like one that was really a problem was the size of the farms. And they'd used these ancient Spanish measurements, went back to the King of Spain, and they changed from Spain to the New World, from Guatemala to Mexico. Salvador is a little different. So just finding out the area of a farm was amazingly problematic. And I don't know if I have it right, but I know I have it pretty close. Leguas and cuerdas and stuff like that, just words that stopped being used a couple hundred years ago. That's how the dimensions of these lands that became the co-op were originally laid out. But I can tell you that when I tell people from Guatemala how big the farms were, they're amazed. We would think it was pretty small here in the States, but for a peasant in Guatemala or an indigenous person, it was a good chunk of land. And the idea was enough land to support a family so you didn't have to be a migrant worker. That was kind of the idea behind the whole thing.
So reading through your book, what came across to me as a reader, because the book was about a community within a specific place during a certain time, and because this community was universally impacted by an event, the outbreak of a civil war between the army and this revived guerrilla movement, the guerrilla of the poor. Because of that, there are common themes that are expressed in every interview throughout the book. And, I when I was getting ready for this interview with you, I sort of imagined it in my mind as a 3-act sort of process. The act one is the hope and promise of a new start in the early 1970s. Act 2 in the interviews is the beginning of the conflict between the army, the guerrilla movement in the mid-1970s heading into the 80s. And finally, Act 3 is usually the memories of all-out war between the army and the guerrillas and the aftermath of that conflict, and at times the return to the Ishkan. But the thing that I enjoyed as a reader about your book, Not Our Day to Die, was how it never at any time came across as monotonous. And the reason why I asked you about how you went about ordering these interviews a couple of times is because while all the interviews, express a shared experience, the way that you put together this book, it feels like a natural journey. And along the way, there are surprises. Like the first sort of third of your book is largely almost documentary-like recollections of people and their experiences living in the Ishkan. But there's this wonderful interview towards the middle of your book of a woman who has a very dreamlike way of expressing, her memories of her time in Ishkan. It begins with a dream that her father had about what would happen to them, about how they would go to this new land and build a new life for themselves, and how it would come apart and they would somehow survive and overcome it. And I thought that, things like that really sort of made the experience of reading your book a journey to be enjoyed. So I commend you for accomplishing that in something that could have been a very dry sort of textbook-like approach to this moment in history.
Yeah, I remember that was Anna Maria. I remember when she was speaking, I was thinking to myself, God, can I even use any of this? But that's what she had to say. And so I wrote it down, put it in, and I'm happy I did. I think it, like you say, it really is a change of pace. It's a very unique perspective.
It is. And I think that's the great accomplishment of your book. The diversity of perspective takes something that is almost unbelievable. The level of violence that these people experienced, almost unbelievable. But because you have interview after interview talking about this experience of having to flee into the jungle, of having to cook food at night to avoid being attacked by helicopters during the day, of having to adapt and survive in a jungle environment and find food that they can grow and cultivate in an environment like that. The experience of fleeing to Mexico as a refugee and living there, it just really sort of brings to life this testimony. And, I want to commend you for what you accomplished here, Mike. Looking back on the experiences of having worked in this community, in this co-op in the early 70s, and then having gone back in the mid 2000s to work on this book, what importance do you think this book has for readers today? What do you think is the value of having memorialized the experiences of members from this community?
Well, I don't know. I don't think it'll change the world, but I think it's an opportunity for people up here to just understand a little bit what went on down there, and especially people from the United States, because we were supporting that violence. And for the people down there, I think it's maybe even more important because it's their voices. And for their children, it'll be the voices of their parents and grandparents. And I think that is just as important as the readership up here.
So it was published just as the United States elected a president that swept into the White House largely on the back of a campaign that vilified refugees trying to make their way to the United States and escape from persecution and danger in their home countries. And, going back to what you said about how you felt that this book was partly important to illustrate the complicated history between the United States and Latin America, I think this book is very important in that regard. Just above the story of the Army and the brutality they brought on the co-op in the community of the Ishkan is the fact that, as you said earlier in the book, the United States was heavily involved in countering leftist movements in Latin America. And what that meant in many respects was either turning a blind eye to terrible atrocities and abuses of human rights, or actively equipping governments and militaries in Latin America to conduct them. And I think that, the fact that reading through this book, many of these interviewees talk about how the violence was so unbearable, their only option was to flee to Mexico. And of course, some of them, one of your interviewees, Ramon Mendoza, talks about first fleeing to Mexico and then again fleeing to the United States to try and build a better life for himself and his family. I think it's a very important book. And just to round out this interview, what do you want people to get out of the book?
Well, I think there's two sort of audiences. Right now, I'm re-editing the sound from the interviews to help somebody put the book in Spanish. And I think that's important for the people themselves. There's two that have died. One had PTSD and committed suicide, and one died of cancer. But the rest of all those people are still alive. And I would like them to have both the audio and a book in Spanish and their children. And then for the U.S. and European, well, mainly U.S. audience, it's hard not to be sympathetic with those people for all they went through. And I would like to point out that these are the same guys, same people that are sitting down on our southern border right now. And maybe through reading this book, the United States could have a little more comprehension of why those people are there, why they want to get into this country. And if they get in, they'll be mowing our lawns and washing dishes in restaurants, but their children won't be. Their children will be teachers, nurses, they'll be techs in the ER. They'll be doctors, and heaven forbid, some of them will probably be lawyers. But so it's not what you read in the press about all those folks. They're the same as the people in this book. And I would like, if nothing else, people in the United States to just have some awareness of who all those folks are trying to get into the country. You mentioned our president talking about rapists and robbers and so on, of people coming up. But pretty legitimate presidents, Eisenhower, he's not really condemned much by anybody, big World War II hero. His administration launched the overthrow of the government that started this mess in 52 or 50, maybe 54. So we have a long history of things to
think about.
Yeah.
Mike, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. It was an honor to talk to you about your work on this book. Once again, we discussed today Not Our Day to Die, Testimony from the Guatemalan Jungle by Michael Sullivan. It's via Terra Nova Books. If you cannot find it at the Terra Nova Books website, then it is available on Amazon. And I would encourage anyone with an interest in Latin America, in Guatemala, or the history of American involvement in Latin America to seek out this book. You will be well rewarded reading these interviews that Mike recorded to produce this book. Mike, thank you again for your time this morning. Full disclosure, Mike Sullivan is a neighbor of mine. He's less than 3 minutes away from me by swift walk. So thank you again, neighbor, for joining me on this podcast.
I feel like I'm farther away on this machine than I am on foot.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you again, Mike.
Okay. Thank you very much.